I recently rewatched The Flash Season 1, and while I was watching it, I got the idea to rank all the episodes of the season now that I've seen them very recently. In this video, I'll be doing just that, looking at all 23 episodes of the season and ranking them from worst to best. I'll give very short reviews, as well as what my score for the episode would be now that I've seen them very recently. So with that in mind, let's start with the worst episode of the season, which isn't that bad because the season overall is one of the best seasons of the Arrowverse, so even the worst one is pretty good.
They're the same person. Are you sure that's wise, Barry? The Flash.
Episode 18 isn't terrible, but I also think it is the worst episode of the season. It's got a terrible main villain with Bug-Eyed Bandit, who is just really over the top and cheesy with all the B puns, which is so distracting in an otherwise very good season. Felicity is a part of it, which doesn't really help, and all the subplots with the relationship drama, it's probably the worst of the season. Although there are some good moments here or there, this episode overall, I would say, is my least favorite episode of the season, in spite of the fact that the Atom is in it, and he's pretty cool.
While his desire to help others is commendable, I give you a head start. You can be a bit of a show-off.
Episode 5, it doesn't really have much going for it other than the first time Barry ran on water, which definitely wasn't as cool as maybe it sounds like it could be, at least not at this point, and General Lang being a pretty good villain. This episode isn't bad, but it just doesn't really have anything to offer to put it higher than where it is on the list.
Meet Captain Clone. Don't worry, I'll come up with something cooler.
Episode 2 was definitely not bad at all. It's got some great moments, like near the end of the episode, Barry talks to Joe about how the fact that Joe raised him. It was pretty emotional, and this episode definitely has a lot of great things going for it, but it also is pretty forgettable for the most part. The villain Multiplex is one of the worst villains of the season, one of the most forgettable villains of the week. So overall, while this episode isn't terrible or even bad, or even I would say it's a little better than okay, it's still not any higher on the list.
That suit does not make everybody safe. For every person you save, there's going to be somebody you can't.
The first couple episodes of the season, except for episode 1, kind of blend together, like episode 2 and 3, and also 5 are very close to each other, as a lot of the beginning episodes of the season have the same formula with the villains of the week. This episode is similar, where it's mostly just about the Flash going up against the Mist, who is a little bit better than Multiplex, so that already gives it an edge over episode 2, and also this scene has more emotional scenes like talks between Henry Allen and Barry or Joe, which is why it's better than that episode 2, but both of these episodes are still lower on the list because they're definitely a little bit more formulaic than most of the season.
It's super cool.
You're a crime-fighting, lady-slaying machine.
Episode 12 is a lot of fun for the most part, with Caitlin and Barry going to a bar. It's definitely a very fun sequence of events. Also, there's a very emotional scene, a talk between Barry and Henry, which you could already tell is one of the highlights of the season. But the lackluster villain and the kind of not a big significance to the plot of the season, it's probably why it's going to be low on the list.
Amazing.
Yeah, you do.
I'll cover for you.
What are you gonna say?
Bad stomachache. Really bad diarrhea.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with that excuse.
Just go.
Episode 4 saw the introduction of one of the most iconic villains in the comics and on the show, Captain Cold, and he definitely holds up this episode. It's why this episode is higher than every episode we've gone over so far, because it's got a very good villain. But other than Captain Cold, I think this episode just doesn't really deserve to be any higher than it is. It's still a very good episode, though.
You'd have to hit him at approximately Mach 1.1. You could create a sonic boom, which, as I've said before, would be...
This episode is certainly not Episode 6 is certainly not one of the better episodes of the season, but it's still got a lot of great things about it. Like, there are a couple scenes of Joe investigating Harrison Wells, which is also one of the highlights of the season. The investigation of Harrison Wells, which at the beginning of the season was mostly done by Joe. This episode also has one of the most notable moments of the season, where Barry does the supersonic punch on a kind of lackluster villain, but still I think this episode overall is not bad.
Here. He's using some kind of sonic technology.
There's been a pipeline breach. Hartley doesn't think I paid for my crimes.
Time to pay the piper.
Episode 11 is pretty good. The main villain of the episode, Pied Piper, also known as Hartley Rathaway, is a fairly good villain who I think that really held up this episode. The rest of the episode, aside of everything to do with Pied Piper, is still pretty good. Definitely not that good, but definitely enough to put it higher than every episode we've gone over so far.
Not Ronnie.
Any attempt to separate the two of them could be catastrophic.
He could go nuclear.
Barry, get out of there!
The first part of the two-parter Firestorm episode, which is definitely not as good as the second part, but it is still pretty good. Like I said, it is part of the Firestorm two-parter, which I thought that whole storyline was very interesting, and I really liked how they handled it. But this episode also has a storyline with Cisco and Joe investigating the murder of Nora Allen, which was obviously has a huge part in the season-long storyline. And although them finding those pictures was a little bit hard to believe, it still was really awesome to see them investigating this, and I really liked how they handled that storyline. So this episode is pretty good.
Your super speed continues to improve.
Still not enough.
Snort.
He's back.
Come out wherever you are, Flash, or this woman dies.
This episode is mostly filler. Not really much of the episode's storyline really contributes to the season-long storyline very much, but I still think it's very good, as it has not one but two great villains in Captain Cold and Heatwave, and that's why it's a lot better than episode 4, which only had Captain Cold, and also I really like Captain Cold a lot more in this episode as well, just because of the villains, just because of a couple of things that were pretty good in this episode. It deserves to be at this point on the list.
It's gone.
He runs slow even for a normal person.
We have to get your speed back. People in this city need protecting.
If you can't protect this city, Dad, I know the Flash will.
This episode was really, really good. This episode saw Barry losing his powers for the majority of it, which was the first time that ever happened. It wasn't the last time, but it definitely was the first, and maybe the most interesting time that it did happen, how they handled that. There's a great climax to the episode with Harrison Wells almost talking down Blackout. I think that this episode is a lot better than most of the episodes in the first third of the season, which is definitely the worst part of the season, but I definitely think that it is still a very good episode.
Probably, you mean Wells.
Wells ordered Grodd to come after us, to distract us.
Hit it!
Episode 21 was, I think, weirdly placed how they had this Gorilla Grodd episode. I think that if they did it maybe earlier in the season, it would have been maybe more interesting, because this is really when the storyline of the season was really ramping up, and this episode felt like it was a little out of nowhere, even though it definitely was a part of the season-long storyline, and that's why it's not a lot higher, despite the fact that it's really, really good with how it uses Gorilla Grodd. It's still, though, definitely a very, very good episode that is around the middle of the list. Yeah, 11 and 12.
Barry Allen, and I am the fastest man alive. A friend recently gave me the idea for a new name, and something tells me it's gonna catch on.
Right around the middle of the list, also right around the middle of the list is episode 1. This episode did a great job at showing Barry Allen's origin story of becoming the Flash, or the beginnings of his origin story. It has a lot of great moments, like a very iconic moment now is the Run Barry Run speech, and also the scene at the end where Harrison Wells unveils the 2024 newspaper. This episode has a lot of great things going about it, and even though it has been, a lot of episodes have been a lot better than it still was a very, very good pilot episode for the show, and it led up to a very good season as well.
It's me. Dude, this is like some Twilight Zone level stuff.
You're gonna change the past.
I won't make the same mistake twice.
Episode 14 was the second part of the Firestorm two-parter, where this one showed a lot more of Firestorm himself, which is really cool to see. I really liked how they handled the dynamic between the two characters in this episode. This episode was complete with a very good return of a villain, General Eiling, who is a great recurring villain in the season, included in this episode. Overall, I think this episode is pretty awesome, so it makes it to the top 10.
Wait, Colin is back?
I thought you and I were friends.
You were right.
I screwed with time, and now time is screwing with me.
Who is the Flash?
Now, I remember this episode being just a very disappointing episode following what is the highest rated episode of the show ever on IMDb, and honestly, it's a lot better than I remember. This is my favorite Captain Cold episode. It's got such an awesome rivalry between the Flash and Captain Cold, a lot better than in episode 4, episode 10, or in episode 22. This episode really showed a great rivalry between those two characters, and overall, I thought this episode was jam-packed with a lot of great moments, and how it handled the aftermath of the time travel from the last episode. It was just overall a lot better than I remembered.
Hope we're not too late.
You can't fight all three of us at the same time.
This is gonna be fun.
Now, I did say that Captain Cold's role in this episode was maybe not as good as it was in episode 16, and I definitely think that, but it is still pretty good. It's probably the second best Captain Cold episode of the season, but unlike episode 16, it contributes to the main storyline of the season a lot, like major ways, specifically where they fight, the almost final fight between the Flash and Reverse Flash, where the Flash is held by Oliver Queen and Firestorm. It's really awesome, which is why it is very high on this list.
Payback time.
It's hard to wrap your head around this.
This is impossible. I'm gonna need to see some proof.
Proof? Proof of what?
Like I said earlier, one of the highlights of the season is the investigation of Harrison Wells. So like I said earlier, one of the highlights of the season was the investigation of Harrison Wells, which this episode had a lot of. This episode showed Joe and Cisco going to Starling City to investigate Harrison Wells, which is awesome. It was really awesome. This episode also had a very good villain of the week with Everyman, who he himself maybe wasn't a great villain, but what he brought to the table was very fun and very interesting. Like the title suggests, Who is Harrison Wells was a great episode of investigating Harrison Wells that pushed the storyline of the season very well, so it's a great episode. The first ever episode of the annual crossover event manages to hold up to this day, as Flash vs. Arrow is a very good episode. This episode has surprisingly good writing, with a lot of very memorable quotes and lines. The fight between the Flash and the Arrow is fairly awesome, and this episode even contributes to the season-long storyline, which most crossovers don't do, and I definitely don't hold that against those other crossovers, but this episode is still a very good episode, and a very good introduction to the annual crossovers that we would see every year going forward.
Don't let him take any more. Catch me.
This man stabbed my mother through the heart.
This is my fight.
Starting off the top 5 is the mid-season finale, The Man in the Yellow Suit, which has got basically everything you ever need in an episode of The Flash Season 1, a good Firestorm storyline, a scene or two where Barry and Henry Allen talk, which are obviously very emotional, and obviously an epic showdown between the Flash and the Reverse Flash, and the first one ever, which is awesome. This episode overall is a very good episode that manages to make it into the top 5 best episodes of The Flash Season 1.
You go below 600 miles per hour, it'll explode.
I can't run forever.
It will blow if you stop moving.
Run!
This episode is awesome. Episode 17 not only has an awesome villain in the titular villain, the Trickster. James Jesse, played by Mark Hamill, is awesome. One of the best villains of the season. Not only that, but this episode also tells the backstory of the Reverse Flash and how he got stranded in the present day. It shows us our best look at the night that Nora Allen died, except for the finale. But even then, the actual fight between the Flash and the Reverse Flash, this episode gave us our best look yet, and still to this day, it is our best look get at that fight. This episode overall was awesome, and it even contributes to the season-long storyline as Eddie Thawne gets involved in the investigation of Harrison Wells, which is just so awesome, and I love how they handled that. This episode is one of my favorite episodes of the season.
Cannot be stopped! What did you do?
He's being erased from existence.
It's me, Mom. It's Barry.
For a while, I didn't really love this episode, as it does have a couple issues that weren't really easy to get past, but looking at it now, rewatching the season, it really holds up. It's a lot better than I remember. The season finale of Season 1, titled Fast Enough, is awesome. It's a great ending to the season. How the season-long storyline leads up to that is perfect, and how they conclude it with this episode is honestly amazing. This episode has some great action, some great emotional moments, like where Barry talks to Henry Allen. The final prison talk of the season is awesome, and obviously Nora Allen's death is incredibly emotional, and this episode has some epic moments as well. This episode is a lot better than I remembered, making it one of the best episodes of
You will die.
Then face me now! Help me!
Let him go.
Oh my god!
While episode 19 is titled Who is Harrison Wells, this is the episode that is peak investigation of Harrison Wells. This episode is the peak of the season-long storyline. This is where it all leads up to, where the team find out basically everything about Eobard Thawne through Gideon, through Cisco's abilities, looking at episode 15's alternate timeline, or the original timeline, or the second timeline of the show. Anyway, this episode is incredibly intense. It's so awesome, and the trap they set for the Reverse Flash with the twist of Harrison Wells, the entirety of this episode, or that part of the episode being the Everyman, and the fact that the Reverse Flash set a trap for them, it all flows so perfectly, and this is my second favorite episode of the season, as the season-long storyline perfectly leads up directly to this in an incredibly epic and very, very intense episode.
Dr. Wells had something to do with Barry's mom's murder.
He's in a wheelchair? How could he possibly have done that?
And what is definitely not very surprising is episode 15 being number 1. This episode is still the highest rated episode of the show ever on IMDb, and for good reason. This episode is practically perfect. Weather Wizard is a very good main villain, and the fact that it all took place in an alternate timeline to the one that we would get to allowed them to do a lot of things that they wouldn't really normally do in a regular episode, which is incredibly surprising the first time you watch it. Like, they crippled David Singh, they killed off Cisco Ramon, they revealed the fact that Barry is the Flash to Iris, and they kissed, and none of that actually happened in the new timeline, but the fact that it all happened in this episode was so surprising the first time you watch it. Not only that, but it really holds up on a rewatch, as the storyline with Cisco and Reverse Flash is incredibly intense and even emotional, and it goes without saying that the ending of the episode with Barry kissing Iris, revealing that he is the Flash, and then going off to stop the tsunami, but instead time traveling, is one of the most awesome moments of the entire show. And because of all those things, this episode is definitely the best episode of the season, and maybe even the best episode of the entire show, but for me, it's actually my second favorite episode. So that is my ranking of all these episodes. Let me know what your ranking would be in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.